6 years prior to the Second World War, when Adolf Hitler came to power, the Dachau concentration camp was established as a prison camp for people who basically weren't on Hitler's side. This first group of prisoners consisted of political prisoners, but also resistance fighters, and even later that year in 1933, the first group of Jewish people were also being locked up at Dachau. However, it wouldn't just stay with one concentration camp, because over the course of 4 years several concentration camps were established throughout Germany, including this one, which was ordered by Heinrich Himmler himself in 1937 and would later be known as Buchenwald, which was originally designed as a work camp, but by the time Buchenwald was liberated by the US troops in 1945, the death rate had reached an astonishing 56,000 people. In order to tell this story right, I am starting our visit at the location where basically hell would start for all the people that were deported to this location, and that is the Buchenwald train station. However, Buchenwald wasn't always equipped with its own train station, because before 1943 all the people that were being brought to Buchenwald would arrive at the civilian train station of Weimar, and after being unloaded they were ordered to march the 8 kilometers to this location on foot. And this is just one out of many facts that show that the city of Weimar was highly involved with all the activities that were taking place at Buchenwald, unlike other cities that always denied knowing about the activities that were taking place at the concentration camps nearby their cities. But in order to speed up the process of getting workers to the ammunition factory of Buchenwald, and perhaps keep all the activities of the concentration camp out of sight for the civilians of Weimar, the decision was made to build a train station directly at Buchenwald itself, which started in the spring of 1943 by inmates of the camp who were ordered to build a 10-kilometer rail line from Weimar to Buchenwald in just 3 months, which was really unrealistic. And after completing the rail line in early 1945, up until the liberation in 1945, over 100,000 people were deported over these rail lines to Buchenwald in order to work at the ammunition factory or the nearby limestone quarry, but it was also used in order to transport people to the death camps to be murdered elsewhere. But all the people that arrived at this train station would eventually be locked up in the main camp of Buchenwald, but not before being registered, and that is the location where we are going to right now. Right now we have moved to the location where every single inmate would have been marched through towards the entrance of the camp, which is located behind me at the end of this road. And since the Germans had a dark sense of humor for certain things, such as the phrases that hung at the entrance of several concentration camps, well, Buchenwald was no different, because this road that you can see before me is the so-called Kacha Path, that was even marked with a wooden sign which was crafted by Bruno Apitz, who was a political prisoner who was relegated to the sculpture division and was forced to produce the sign according to the instruction of the SS. And according to Buchenwald survivors, this road that took them to the main camp was what they remembered the most from the time that they were locked up in Buchenwald, as this was their first introduction after days of being locked up in freight cars, where they were then led through this road where they were welcomed by shouting SS guards with German shepherds. And once they were locked up in the main camp of Buchenwald, their stay became a kind of a blur that was necessary for survival, and that is why this particular road sticked with them as clear as it was that day. I've moved to the end of the Kacha Path where the registration of the newly arrived inmates would have been done, and that was this location which you can see before me. However, this building, which was part of the political division who were overseen by the main office of the Gestapo in Weimar, was destroyed during an aerial bombardment in August of 1944 in order to destroy the ammunition factory, which was located a few hundred meters in front of us, and this building was the only one that was hit by the aerial bombardment. And after the registration, the newly arrived inmates would march the final stretch of the Kacha Path to the main gate, which you can see right over there. After the inmates would arrive by truck or train and were registered at the registration building, they eventually would arrive at this place, which was the main entrance of Buchenwald. But besides it being the main entrance of Buchenwald, it was also used by the political division, who were responsible for the registration, interrogation and torture of every single person who was locked up in Buchenwald. And that would take place in the left section of the main gate building, where the political division established the camp prison of Buchenwald, or as it was known among the inmates as the bunker, due to the fact that it had no windows, and all the people that were ever locked up in the bunker were often locked up in complete darkness for days or even weeks on end, because they were accused of resistance or sabotage in some way. But basically any act was good enough to end up in the bunker, which resulted in the fact that from 1938 on, this building was always fully occupied up until the liberation in 1945. And every newly arrived inmate that would enter the main gate of Buchenwald would do so through that very gate right over there. So this is the gate which we just walked through into the main gate of Buchenwald, and it is still the original gate where many people were robbed of that little bit of freedom which they had, and where many people walked through but were never able to witness the liberation of Buchenwald in 1945. And like many other concentration camps, this camp also had a cynical phrase which says jedem das seine, or in English means to each his own, which was cynically used for describing a concept of justice, since every person that was locked up at Buchenwald would eventually get what he deserves according to the SS. And to make matters worse, the phrase was also only legible from the inside out, so that the inmates were always able to read it during the roll calls, which were located behind me, and it was also painted in highly visible red, which was renewed on the inmate side every single year until the liberation in April of 1945. We have moved into the main camp of Buchenwald, and this is the view that every new inmate would see whenever entering this camp for the very first time. And as you can see, nowadays there are no barracks left, but between 1937 and 1945, under command of the Germans, and even after the war, during the Cold War, under command of the Russians, who turned Buchenwald into a work camp or a stalag, There would have been rows and rows of barracks leading all the way down the slope towards a smaller camp which was isolated within Buchenwald and was called the Little Camp during the Nazi regime. But I'll talk more about that in a second, because the square which you can see before me was the so-called Appellplatz or roll call square, where every single inmate was accounted for twice a day. And during these roll calls, the inmates were lined up endlessly or were ordered to sing for hours on end. And if there were inmates who couldn't or refused to take part in the obligations made by the guards, they were pretty much assured of their death. I am moving out of the main camp for a minute in order to show you another way how the Germans would show their superiority against the inmates, like they did during the roll calls and the cynical phrase on the main gate. Because in 1938 the first camp commander Karl Koch decided to build a zoo as a form of rest and recreation for the SS guards and their families, where they could enjoy viewing monkeys, deer and even brown bears. But it also happened that Karl Koch himself would visit the zoo with his son, who was just a few years old at the time, and that this was all in plain sight of the prisoners who were just on the other side of this fence. And another bizarre thing is that the finances of the zoo also came from the prisoners themselves through forced donations imposed by the SS. And I'm still not done showing the extreme contrast between the inmates and the guards, because the camp commander Karl Koch placed the well-being of the animals over that of the inmates who were locked up in this camp, because whenever a member of the SS would beat any animals, they would be punished for their actions. However, if they would beat or kill an inmate, that wouldn't result in a punishment whatsoever. And that extreme contrast between the animals and the human is something which I just can't get my head around. During the time Buchenwald was operational, the Germans used the inmates to do harsh manual labor in the nearby quarry or at the ammunition factory, but also during the build of the rail line that led towards the camp. But although some prisoners were allowed to leave the camp under supervision of the guards, this was definitely built to keep people locked up within this place for good. And that is because this is what the people on this side of the fence would see during their time in Buchenwald, which was a 3-kilometer long fence that surrounded the entire camp, and the fence system consisted of several security areas outfitted with a no entry zone where no individual was allowed to get in. And besides the no entry zone, there would have been the Spanish rider obstacles and tripwires. And if an inmate managed to get past these obstacles without getting shot by the guards that were located in the guard towers, they would face a electric fence that would kill them instantly. Well, a minute ago I told you that the Buchenwald Zoo was also financed by the prisoners through forced donations. Well, this is one of those ways how the SS managed to get money from the prisoners to do so, because this is the inmates' canteen, which was officially a store that opened in 1941, where inmates could supposedly buy everything that they needed, but in fact, instead of urgently needed basic food stuff, the SS sold products here at a high price, which the inmates had previously produced themselves in Buchenwald, but it was also only accessible for a select group of inmates who were allowed to purchase these self-made low-quality products. This was simply one means for the SS to squeeze out additional money of the inmates and their families to maintain the Buchenwald Zoo, for an example. However, during the existence of Buchenwald, there was a resistance group active in this camp that would protect certain inmates and would take over command of this camp just before the liberation of Buchenwald. But another thing that they would do was create ammunition, and that would happen in the basement of this canteen, where a soapworks was located, But the men who were part of that work commando making soap were also creating something else without the Germans knowing, and that were self-produced Molotov cocktails that would be used by the camp resistance during the liberation of Buchenwald. And there were even experiments with self-constructed hand grenades. So pretty interesting to see that in a place like Buchenwald there were also men that were still fighting against the Germans in a place like this. By 1943, the Third Reich was running at full speed when it came to the fabrication of war industries, and since Buchenwald was the main camp of several sub-camps with their own manufacturing, from V1 rockets at Milbau Dora to ammunition which was produced within Buchenwald but also close by Buchenwald, and from here those and other sub-camps were supplied with new workers. At first, the workers that would be deported to a sub-camp of Buchenwald would be kept in a separate quarantine camp which was called Little Camp, and that was located at the very end of the main camp of Buchenwald. However, by early 1945 this became an overcrowded place where people were basically wasted away and were dying. As a result, in less than 100 days some 6,000 people died here before the camp was liberated just 1 or 2 months later. After the Second World War, Buchenwald was immediately taken into use as a Stalag by the Russians, and in August of 1945 they had the barracks of the Little Camp torn down, which resulted in the fact that between 1945 and 1950 the Little Camp area was overgrown and was nearly forgotten. But in 2002 this memorial was erected to commemorate the nearly 6,000 people who died in the hell of Buchenwald. Also inscripted in the monument are all the names of the locations from which people were transported to the Little Camp. But perhaps the most impressive fact about this memorial is that it was designed by the New York architect Stephen Jacobs, who was an inmate himself who was locked up in the Little Camp and was only 6 years old by the time the American 6th Armored Division liberated Buchenwald in 1945. I've moved to the very end of the former Little Camp, and this what you see is a part of a reconstruction to show where one of the children barracks would have stood during the Buchenwald era. Because during the final years of the war, the number of children and youth at Buchenwald increased immensely, and particularly many Jewish boys came to Buchenwald as part of the evacuation transports from Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen in early 1945, after the Russians were closing in on those concentration camps. And in order to give the youth a chance of survival, prisoner functionaries and Jewish inmates set up a second children block in Block 66, which was located before me. However, the first one had existed since the summer of 1943 in Block 8, which mainly housed Polish, Ukrainian and Russian boys, and later also Jewish boys were added to Block 8. And Block 66, however, primarily housed Jewish boys from Hungary and Poland, who were often already orphans without them knowing it for themselves after arriving at Buchenwald. For them, the children blocks served as a sort of safe space in which they were protected from random violence or abuse, but also from heavy forced labor, where prisoner functionaries took care of the boys and made sure that they were given additional food, clothing, and heating materials. But it was only after the liberation of Buchenwald that the success of the children blocks was shown, because of the 904 children and youth that were in Buchenwald. Most of them had survived thanks to these children barracks. Also part of the Buchenwald concentration camp is this barrack, which was part of the inmates hospital, because just 1 year after Buchenwald was erected, many people were getting sick due to the lack of food, hard labor and the constant lack of water, and because of this there were some barracks built to serve as a camp infirmary, but not much later it would be known by the inmates as the precinct. However, the fact that there was an infirmary at all at Buchenwald was the result of the persistent effort done by the political prisoners, who largely served as the caretakers within the camp, but there was a constant lack of medication, bandages, basically the simple equipment to heal people that were brought into the infirmary. And to make matters worse, from 1941 on, these so-called infirmary barracks would also turn into murder barracks, where the SS doctors would kill numerous sick inmates on their own by poisonous injection, which was done on a daily basis. And another thing where these infirmary barracks were used for was the selection of inmates who would go on transportation to the so-called euthanasia killing centers like Sonnestein and Bernburg, where inmates no longer fit for work and Jewish inmates were suffocated by gas. I've reached the final building that I'm going to visit while I am at Buchenwald, and this is the former crematorium of Buchenwald, which was used from mid-1940 till some days before the liberation in 1945. Because before 1940 the bodies of the people that were murdered or died were brought to the nearby crematorium at Weimar. So this is just another fact that shows that the civilians and the city of Weimar were highly involved with all the activities that took place at Buchenwald. But in order to camouflage their activities for the people of Weimar, the Nazis built this crematorium to do so, and perhaps to speed up the process of getting rid of the bodies. But besides being a crematorium, this building was also used for other activities where Buchenwald was famous for, such as the building to the left that is attached to this crematorium, which was the pathology dissecting room, and in here the golden teeth of the deceased were extracted, and even organs were removed as anatomical specimens, which were provided to universities. And another speciality was the production of macabre gift items, which members of the SS bestowed on one another. Human skins, preferable tattooed, were cut from the bodies, tanned and worked into everyday objects. And that being said, let's go into this horrific building, which was the crematorium from 1940 all the way up until 1945. I just walked into the room where thousands of bodies were cremated who died due to harsh manual labor or due to malnutrition or simply because they were murdered by the SS. And the cremation of the bodies would happen in the incinerators, which you can see before me, which were specially developed by the Topf&Sohn company, which was located in Erfurt. And since these incinerators were such a success, they were also installed in different camps throughout Europe, such as Auschwitz, Mauthausen and Gross-Rosen and even Dachau. And from here the ashes would be dumped like garbage in some natural sinkholes that were located in the area. Well, I have come to the end of all the dark and horrific activities that took place within Buchenwald, but in order to end this video in a somewhat positive way, there is one last thing that I want to mention, and that is about the clock that you can see above the entry gate. And because after the 6th Armored Division was gaining terrain in Germany and were getting closer to the Ettersberg where Buchenwald was located in 1945, the political inmates who belonged to the resistance in the camp managed to overpower the few SS guards that were still left in Buchenwald and even occupy the gate building, raising a white flag. They thereby signaled the flight of the SS from the area to the US troops and temporarily took command over the Buchenwald concentration camp. The moment that they were finally liberated from the horrors of the Nazis was on April 11th, 1945 at 3:15 p.m. Today that time is commemorated by the frozen positions of the hands of the gate clock, which you can see right over here.